決まりですね。
Orochimaru, the once-in-a-lifetime prodigy, and Kisame, the monster of the hidden mist. The shark and the snake, two members of the Akatsuki that pretty much never interact. One lost themselves along the way, and one found satisfaction in his death. These two characters hardly, if ever, interact, and I'm sort of hard-pressed to find if anything resembles a conversation. And most of the time, they are completely separate for the series. In part 1, Orochimaru has left the Akatsuki and Kisame is introduced shortly after Hiruzen's died, while in part 2, Orochimaru is, well, dead, but, that's fine. And these two characters' power level, for say, or their caliber of being a shinobi, varies drastically throughout the series. Kisame gets a huge power increase from part 1 to 2, and Orochimaru goes through multiple buffs and nerfs, for example, when he loses his arms and when he switches body and all that stuff, so we're really just going to keep it to 2 to 3 fights. These two characters can't really fight without there being some time travel shenanigans, but we'll talk about what we're actually doing right now. So what we're going to be doing is part 1 Orochimaru versus part 1 Kisame, and then obviously they're part 2 counterparts, but we'll actually overlap them just to see how it is, because I think when we overlap them we get a far more interesting discussion. These two characters can be placed pretty comfortably below characters such as Itachi and Pain, who pretty much in every interpretation bully them outright. They're pretty much the middle Akatsuki guys along with Kakuzu and maybe Sasori, but it's mainly these three characters are the middlemen of the Akatsuki. Something that I find interesting about Orochimaru is that in every fight just about, he is always screwing around and laughing. Even when he fights Kakashi, he isn't taking him seriously, and in the Chunin exams he fights Naruto and Sasuke and goes out of his way to buff Sasuke and nerf Naruto. Another thing that you'll note about Orochimaru is that Kakashi is stated to be the #1 ninja of Konoha. Now, he's obviously not talking about people like Tsunade and Jiraiya and the Sannin and those sort of people, but what's being stated here is that in terms of the normal people, Kakashi should be the strongest. Another great feat for Orochimaru in terms of his lore is that the Akatsuki actually cannot be bothered taking him down and are actually more satisfied with him being a part of the Akatsuki to keep an eye of him. Now, this may be sort of a higher interpretation, but I think this might be because of his pseudo-immortality, and maybe you think Nagato or, maybe Itachi, who is sort of still spying, can tell that Orochimaru is going to be difficult to kill. And we can actually even see that this is true because Anko can still kind of carry his life essence or whatever that's about. And if you don't agree with this sort of interpretation, that's fine, but what you could also look towards to keep Orochimaru at this high level is that Hiruzen himself, alongside other ninja of Konoha, cannot take down Orochimaru, and that he's the greatest threat to Konoha. And maybe you think, this statement is a little bit sketchy, but when Orochimaru is actually beating Hiruzen, Orochimaru actually says, wow, if you were 10 years younger, you could have probably defeated me pretty easily. So it's fairly consistent that Orochimaru is this Sannin plus kind of level opponent. Things get even more interesting when we consider the Hydra snake summon. Now, the statement in the data book is fairly crazy about this Hydra snake. It says, Orochimaru's 8-headed serpent appears from Sasuke's curse mark. The serpent crushes the Uchiha hideout by simply slithering over it. This is Orochimaru's greatest and most powerful jutsu. This means not Edo Tensei, this means not his immortality. None of this is as strong as this serpent. And if Orochimaru had a sage mode because his body, was imperfect and he needed an equivalent, this is Orochimaru's sage mode. This is his big amp to surpass the Sannin, similar to how Jiraiya did it with his, sage mode, and similar how Tsunade did it with her 100 healings. Orochimaru also has Edo Tensei, which is just its own crazy thing that I don't see a lot of people talking about, at all. Obviously, the first and second Hokage, they speak for themselves, but what a lot of people don't know is that he actually has the third Kaze Kage, and Orochimaru uses this summon to fight Deidara, and whether or not you think, it was filler and it's not canon or whatever, if you think it is canon, it can still give the Akatsuki a really hard time. Orochimaru's physicality is strong enough to brawl Four Tails Kid Naruto, and you got to remember that this Orochimaru is extremely nerfed. He's pretty much on his deathbed. He's going to die soon. He dies within, I think it's a few days. And this Four Tails Naruto almost killed Jiraiya. It actually put him near death. If we include the Rashomon gates, his 5 chakra natures, he actually has every chakra nature, which is insane. And all of his snake substitution jutsus, his regeneration hacks, it's no wonder why Orochimaru was the big bad of part 1. And now we get into Kisame, which, dude, poor Kisame in part 1 is really not that impressive at all. He gets tagged by Asuma. Asuma can hold his Samehara pretty comfortably. He can almost get hit by Kakashi. He's getting tagged by, Guy a few times. So you get this idea that he's actually not too impressive, and this is actually supported by the fact that Kisame himself, unfortunately for this matchup, doesn't think he's Sanin level. Now we get to the most contentious part of pretty much any Naruto topic I could pretty much think of. So what happens here is that Jiraiya makes Itachi and Kisame run away, and there's a few ways to interpret this. The first interpretation is that Kishimoto didn't know how strong Itachi and Kisame were. That's the first one. The second one is that you think Itachi is this giga-brained master manipulator, freak of nature, and he's trying to kind of gaslight Kisame into thinking that he's pretty weak. And he does this kind of at the start of his fight with Guy anyway. He says, don't underestimate him. He's kind of just gaslighting Kisame to thinking he's weak. Or what could happen is that, maybe Kisame just gets stronger throughout the series, which is what I think is far more likely. So unfortunately for Kisame in part 1, he doesn't really stand much of a chance at all. I don't think anyone is arguing part 1 Kisame versus part 1 Orochimaru, but we'll get into part 2 now. And part 2 Kisame, man, is just a completely different animal because right off the bat he shows off new moves and he's pretty much upscaled to a huge degree. We see in his fight with Guy that he uses a 30% clone. Now, 30% can mean various things. 30% can mean actual chakra volume. Now, volume means stuff like, how Naruto has more chakra than Kakashi, that's chakra volume. But it might actually just mean that Kisame is weaker. Now, I don't actually think Kisame is much weaker here. He just has less chakra than normal. And this specific version of Kisame can also fight Killer Bee. And this is where we get a huge upscale for Kisame. Now, fighting Bee is very, very impressive. He's pretty much the second strongest Jinchuriki next to Naruto. And you got to remember that this Killer Bee can fight Sasuke and Minato. And, Killer Bee says, wow, I think he's the toughest guy I've ever fought, which is an insane statement because Bee's fought, in the Third War. He's fought Minato. Minato's, hailed as the Yellow Flash. Sasuke is the strongest opponent, and Bee just kills Sasuke numerous times. So you get this idea that, Obito had to entrust Kisame to capture Bee, and Kisame does get bodied pretty hard, but this is where we get into Kisame's sort of special ability, and he says, "The stronger my opponent is, the stronger I become myself." So this is maybe consistent, maybe you think oh yeah, he fought Kakashi, he's not that strong. He fought base guy, he thinks, base guy maybe is his limit. And, the Sanin's obviously his limit, but he fights, these people. And then he just fights the second strongest Jinchuriki from what we know of. And fighting Guy in his gates is pretty crazy because, we know that Guy is around Kakashi's equal, give or take. In part 2 it might change, but Kakashi actually gets stronger from part 1 to part 2, and he doesn't really try much. So Kakashi and Guy being equal is sort of a little bit not really the case in part 2 because we know that Kakashi gets stronger and then Guy uses the gates and they have this progression. But what's really impressive is that the 7th gate is actually what it took to take down Kisame. And we know that, scaling the 7th gate exactly is kind of weird, but, because it fights Ten Tails Madara, but that's not really a feat, but that's just impressive that it is this strong. Not that Kisame is, Jubi Madara level, but what we should talk about now is probably how strong fused Kisame is. Now, the statements around fused Kisame is pretty literal. he pretty much gets the power of a tailed beast without himself being a tailed beast. And he uses this in conjunction with the water ball. Now, in this sort of technique, what he does is that he traps B, and he can actually speed blitz B numerous times and can absorb chakra. So, if he whips this out on Orochimaru, as, you know, with the Edo Tensei, and maybe Orochimaru isn't trying and he gets reckless, it's hard to say exactly if he would actually be able to stop this water bubble. And, you know, you might be able to say, like, what happens if he's in his Hydra form? Well, the Hydra's pretty much a Sage technique, so it should use Sage Chakra. And we have no idea whether or not Kisame can actually absorb that much Sage Chakra. He might just turn into a snake. But it's these sort of questions that make this fight really weird, like, because he can actually absorb chakra on contact. He does this with B, and B states like, oh my god, like, I'm losing chakra. And would he be able to do this to the Edo Tensei? Like, can the Edo Tensei actually damage him? For the most part, I think Kisame in this part, if he whips out the water bubble, could probably take down Orochimaru because the technique is so powerful. But unfortunately, I don't actually think Orochimaru in part 1 could give part 2 Kisame the chakra needed to use this technique. Because we know that he just absorbs so much chakra when B uses his lariat. He gets that huge hole in his chest, he touches Samehara, and then he pretty much absorbs all that chakra. And then after that, that's when he uses the water bubble. And Orochimaru's chakra, it has these weird lore implications. You know, Kabuto talks about it really highly, but it doesn't have that sort of rich Jinchuriki-like chakra. You know, it's so powerful, this Jinchuriki kind of tailed beast chakra, that Nagato can absorb Killer Bee's lariat instantly, like, you know, that. And he pretty much gets all of his powers back from when he was kind of Tendo Pain fighting Naruto in the Leaf Village. And we know Orochimaru doesn't fight like that. He kind of messes around a little bit. He kind of likes to make fun of his opponents. He kind of likes to toy with them and then run away. But this is what I'm saying. If this water bubble comes out, it's a wrap. It's absolutely a wrap for Orochimaru. He doesn't have the speed to run away from Kisame. If Killer Bee and the Raikage are kind of on par, and, you know, the Raikage is one of the fastest shinobi alive, and B's kind of on that level as well. Not as fast, obviously, but he's close. He's not too far away. Orochimaru does not have the ability to escape, unless you think he could probably maybe, you know, reverse summon himself, which I can see a case for. But this Kisame, this hypothetical part 2 Kisame and hypothetical part 1 Orochimaru could probably just run away, and it would be a win for Kisame. But this is where we get to the weird part. Part 2 versus part 2, and it's just a wrap for Orochimaru. He doesn't have his Edo Tensei, he doesn't have all of his abilities. He is still sort of immortal, so what I could actually see happening is that Kisame could actually take down Orochimaru. He wouldn't kill him, he wouldn't put him down forever. You got to remember, Kisame has a hard time sealing people. He might have the Akatsuki sealing jutsu that he uses to seal down the Bijou and all that sort of stuff, but he actually cannot put down the Edo Tensei without maybe using a water prison. I can totally see that happening. But guys, I think that's the video. I think Orochimaru pretty much wins in part 1, absolutely no difficulty. Part 2, I think Kisame will get the upper hand, you know, if he whips out the water bubble and, you know, that sort of stuff. But I honestly don't think that Orochimaru could probably give Kisame the chakra to do so. I can also see a case for Orochimaru just seeing that, oh wow, like Kisame is really strong, and then just running away, because he kind of does that. But a hypothetical part 1 versus part 2, you know, part 1 Orochimaru, part 2 Kisame, I honestly could see it going either way. And I know that's kind of a cop-out answer, but there's just so many things you got to consider. Like, I honestly just think as well, Orochimaru would probably just run away like a weirdo. But, you know, that's the video, guys. Thanks so much for watching. It's gonna be, I think next week I'll upload a Kakashi video. And yeah, subscribe if you want to see more. Cheers.